The final walk on Indiana's death row is quiet. No crowds, no announcements, just a short corridor inside a maximum security prison where time has already run out. For decades, this space has existed between life and death, used rarely, but with permanent consequences. What actually happens in Indiana when the state prepares to take a life, and how did it reach that point? This documentary examines the real, verified history of Indiana's death row and the final moments that define it. It is based entirely on public records, court documents, and confirmed reporting. The focus is not on crime as spectacle, but on how the death penalty operates inside one U.S. state, legally, procedurally, and psychologically. We will look at where Indiana's death row is located, how executions are carried out, and what happens in the final days before an execution. Everything presented here is factual, historical, and intended for public education. This documentary is for educational and informational purposes only. All content is based on factual, research-driven information from public records, official documents, court filings, and reporting by reputable media and human rights organizations. No information is intentionally fabricated or exaggerated. Before we proceed, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to support the channel. Indiana's death row is located inside Indiana State Prison, one of the oldest operating prisons in the state. Opened in 1860, the facility has housed some of Indiana's most serious offenders and serves as the central location for male inmates sentenced to death. Death row in Indiana is not a large unit. At its peak, it held fewer than 30 inmates. Unlike some states, Indiana has used the death penalty sparingly, with long gaps between executions. All death sentences and executions are overseen by the Indiana Department of Correction. Executions are carried out by lethal injection, following state law and a strict protocol reviewed by courts. Before an inmate ever reaches death row, the legal process is long and complex. A death sentence can only be imposed after a capital trial, a separate penalty phase, and automatic appeals. Most inmates remain on death row for decades as appeals move through state and federal courts. Daily life on Indiana's death row is highly controlled. Inmates are kept in single cells. Movement is limited. Contact with other inmates is minimal. Every routine, from meals to recreation, is regulated. As execution dates approach, the atmosphere changes. Legal options narrow. Appeals conclude. Clemency decisions move to the governor's office. For prison staff, preparations begin quietly and months in advance. Indiana's last execution took place in 2009. Since then, death row has remained, even as executions stopped. Some inmates have died of natural causes while still under a death sentence. Others have had sentences overturned or reduced after years of litigation. The system continues to exist, even when it is not used. And inside Indiana State Prison, one small section remains reserved for a moment that may or may not ever come again. What happens when the final appeals are exhausted and the state moves from sentence to action? When an execution date is set in Indiana, it marks the end of a legal process that often spans decades. By this stage, direct appeals, post-conviction reviews, and federal habeas petitions have all been exhausted or denied. The authority to schedule an execution rests with the Indiana Supreme Court. Once the court issues an order, the date becomes official. From that moment forward, every remaining option becomes limited by time. In the final weeks, defense attorneys may submit last appeals based on new evidence, procedural claims, or constitutional challenges. At the same time, attention turns to clemency, a separate process outside the courts. Clemency decisions in Indiana fall to the office of the governor of Indiana. The governor has the power to commute a death sentence to life imprisonment or grant a reprieve. Historically, this authority has been used rarely. While legal teams work urgently, prison officials begin quiet preparations. Execution protocols are reviewed. Staff assignments are finalized. Medical contractors are confirmed according to state policy. For the inmate, conditions change as well. Contact with attorneys becomes more frequent. Visits from spiritual advisors are scheduled. Family visitation rules are adjusted to allow final meetings. These days are structured but tense. Everything follows policy, yet every action carries irreversible weight. In Indiana, executions have always been conducted within the prison itself. There are no public announcements inside the facility, no countdown clocks, only written orders, sealed documents, and carefully timed steps. As the scheduled date approaches, attention turns to one final safeguard: whether the state will proceed or whether intervention will arrive at the last possible moment. And as midnight draws closer, one question remains unanswered until the very end. Will the execution move forward, or will the system stop itself in time? On the day of an execution in Indiana, everything follows a written protocol developed by the Indiana Department of Correction and reviewed through years of legal challenges. The condemned inmate is moved to a holding area near the execution chamber. This transfer is quiet and procedural. There are no public witnesses inside the prison beyond those authorized by law. The inmate is offered final visits. These may include immediate family, legal counsel, and a spiritual advisor. Conversations are private but monitored for security. Time limits are enforced, even when emotions run high. Meals are handled according to policy. The inmate may choose a final meal within specific guidelines, though some decline. Medical staff are present, not to treat, but to observe and confirm procedures required by law. Indiana conducts executions by lethal injection. The process is designed to follow a fixed sequence, with each step documented. Prison staff assigned to the execution are trained in advance and rotated to limit long-term psychological impact. At the scheduled hour, witnesses are escorted into a viewing area. These may include representatives of the media, members of the victim's family, and official observers. The inmate is secured, and final statements, if any, are recorded. Indiana's most recent execution took place in 2009, when Brandon Vaught was put to death after being convicted of murder. Following that execution, no further executions have occurred in the state, despite death sentences remaining in place. Once the execution is completed, death is formally pronounced. The witnesses are escorted out. The chamber is closed. The prison returns to routine operations, often within hours. Outside the prison walls, legal records are updated. Appeals are terminated. The case officially ends. But inside the system, the impact does not disappear. For staff, witnesses, and institutions involved, the event becomes part of the permanent history of Indiana's justice system. And even after the final step is taken, the larger question remains unresolved. What does it mean for a state to carry out a punishment it uses so rarely, yet maintains so deliberately? When an execution ends in Indiana, the legal case closes, but the system does not reset. Records are archived. Court orders are finalized. The sentence is marked as carried out. Inside Indiana State Prison, the execution chamber is secured and left unused. There is no public ceremony, no permanent memorial, and no formal debrief made public. The space remains part of the prison, but it is rarely discussed. Indiana's last execution occurred in 2009, when Brandon Vance was put to death following his conviction for multiple murders. Since that moment, Indiana has not carried out another execution. This absence is not the result of a formal repeal of the death penalty. Capital punishment remains legal in the state. Courts continue to impose death sentences in rare cases. Death row remains active. However, executions have stalled due to a combination of legal challenges, drug procurement issues, and growing scrutiny of lethal injection protocols nationwide. Like many states, Indiana has faced difficulties obtaining execution drugs that meet legal and regulatory standards. As years pass without executions, death row inmates continue to age inside the system. Some die of natural causes. Others have sentences reduced or overturned through appeals. A small number remain under sentence of death, with no execution date set. For victims' families, this long pause creates uncertainty. For inmates, it creates a different kind of limbo, neither release nor resolution. The death penalty in Indiana still exists on paper, in law books, and in prison architecture. But in practice, it stands still. And that raises a critical question for the state moving forward. What happens when a punishment remains legal, but unused for an entire generation? Indiana's death row today exists in a state of uncertainty. The cells remain. The legal framework remains. But the final step, execution, has not occurred in more than a decade. At Indiana State Prison, death row inmates live under sentences that are legally active but practically stalled. There are no execution dates on the calendar. No official moratorium has been declared. Instead, the system pauses without a clear explanation or endpoint. This situation is not unique to Indiana. Across the United States, many states with active death penalty laws have gone years, or even decades, without carrying out executions. Court challenges, changes in lethal injection standards, and pharmaceutical restrictions have slowed or stopped the process. In Indiana, lethal injection remains the only authorized method. But obtaining drugs that meet constitutional and medical standards has become increasingly difficult. Suppliers often refuse to participate. States face lawsuits over secrecy, protocol changes, and potential risks. As a result, execution procedures are reviewed repeatedly but rarely used. Training is maintained. Policies stay on record. Yet the execution chamber remains closed. For inmates, this creates a unique psychological and legal condition. They are sentenced to death, but not scheduled to die. Some continue to pursue appeals. Others wait without active cases, knowing the sentence still exists. For the courts, each new capital case raises a difficult question. Can a sentence be considered functional if it is unlikely to be carried out? For lawmakers and the public, the pause forces a broader discussion about purpose. Is the death penalty meant to be a deterrent, a punishment, or a symbolic sentence? And if it is rarely enforced, what role does it truly play in the justice system? Indiana's death row continues to operate quietly, holding people condemned under laws that remain valid but dormant. And until the state either resumes executions or formally ends the practice, the final outcome remains unresolved. What does justice look like when the system itself cannot decide whether to move forward or stop? As Indiana's death row remains inactive, pressure on the system continues to build from multiple directions. Court challenges have reshaped how the death penalty functions nationwide. Rulings from federal courts and the Supreme Court of the United States have narrowed who can be sentenced to death and how executions must be carried out. Cases involving mental competency, intellectual disability, and procedural fairness have forced states to revise long-standing practices. Indiana has had to adapt to these changes, even without carrying out executions. Each death sentence is automatically reviewed. Each appeal is examined under evolving constitutional standards. What was legally acceptable decades ago may no longer meet current requirements. Public opinion has also shifted. Polling over the past several years shows declining support for capital punishment across much of the United States. Concerns about wrongful convictions, unequal application, and prolonged death row confinement have become central to the debate. In Indiana, lawmakers have introduced bills both supporting and questioning the death penalty. Some argue it remains a necessary option for the most extreme crimes. Others point to its high cost, long delays, and limited use as reasons to reconsider its role. Victims' families are often caught between these positions. Some seek finality through execution. Others say decades of appeals prolong pain rather than resolve it. The system provides no single outcome that satisfies every expectation. Meanwhile, prosecutors continue to face a strategic decision. Seeking the death penalty requires years of litigation, significant resources, and no guarantee the sentence will ever be carried out. In some cases, life without parole is pursued instead, offering certainty over delay. Indiana's death row remains legally intact, but increasingly questioned, from courtrooms, legislatures, and the public. The longer the pause continues, the harder it becomes to separate law from practice. And with each passing year, the unresolved issue grows more complex. Can a punishment remain credible when its future is uncertain and its use continues to fade? For the men who remain on Indiana's death row, daily life continues without a clear timeline. Inside Indiana State Prison, death row inmates live under conditions more restrictive than the general prison population. They are housed separately, typically in single cells. Movement is limited. Contact with others is controlled and monitored. Unlike inmates serving life sentences, death row inmates live with a sentence that is unresolved. There is no release date. There is no confirmed execution date. The future remains undefined. Some inmates continue to pursue legal appeals, even after years or decades. Others reach a point where no active appeals remain, yet no execution is scheduled. This state of waiting can last indefinitely. Correctional policies are designed to maintain order and safety, not to provide certainty. Routine becomes a coping mechanism. Days follow the same structure. even as the sentence itself remains unresolved. For prison staff, managing death row without executions presents its own challenges. Officers are trained to supervise inmates sentenced to death, even though the final procedure may never occur. The responsibility remains, regardless of how rarely the system is used. Mental health services are available, but they operate within the same limits as the rest of the prison system. Long-term confinement under a death sentence creates psychological pressure that is difficult to measure and varies from person to person. Indiana's death row, once designed as a temporary stop before execution, has become something else entirely, a permanent holding space for a punishment that no longer moves forward. And as years pass without resolution, the question becomes harder to avoid. What does a death sentence mean when time keeps moving, but the sentence does not? Maintaining death row in Indiana carries consequences beyond the inmates themselves. Capital cases are among the most expensive in the criminal justice system. From the initial trial through decades of appeals, death penalty cases cost significantly more than cases seeking life without parole. These costs include specialized trials, expert witnesses, extended court proceedings, and long-term incarceration under heightened security. Even without executions, Indiana continues to bear these expenses. Death row housing requires additional staffing, stricter security protocols, and separate facilities. Legal reviews continue long after sentencing, consuming court time and public resources. At the same time, the long delay between sentence and outcome creates uncertainty for everyone involved. Victims' families often wait decades without closure. Some express frustration that a sentence meant to deliver finality instead prolongs the legal process. For the legal system, this delay raises difficult questions about fairness and purpose. If a sentence is imposed but not carried out, its role becomes unclear. The punishment exists, but its effect is diluted by time and uncertainty. Judges and juries continue to operate within laws that allow capital punishment, yet they do so knowing that the sentence may never be enforced. This awareness can influence charging decisions, plea negotiations, and sentencing outcomes. Indiana's death penalty system was built for finality. Instead, it now operates in prolonged suspension. The structure remains intact. The authority remains legal, but the outcome remains uncertain. And with each passing year, the gap widens between what the law allows and what the system actually delivers. At what point does a punishment designed for final moments become a permanent condition instead? Indiana now stands at a crossroads shared by many states with inactive death rows. The law still allows capital punishment. Courts can still impose it. Death row still operates inside Indiana State Prison. Yet the practical use of the death penalty continues to decline. Some lawmakers have proposed limiting or repealing capital punishment, arguing that life without parole provides certainty without decades of delay. Others maintain that the death penalty must remain available for the most extreme cases, even if rarely used. At the same time, prosecutors are increasingly cautious. Seeking a death sentence requires years of litigation with no guarantee of enforcement. In many cases, life sentences are viewed as more reliable and less costly. National trends also influence Indiana's path. Several U.S. states have formally abolished the death penalty. Others maintain it in law but have not carried out executions in decades. Indiana currently falls into this second category. For those already on death row, the future remains unclear. Their sentences are legally valid. Their confinement continues. But the possibility of execution remains distant and undefined. The system, as it exists today, offers no clear resolution, only continuation. And that leaves Indiana with a decision it has not yet made. Will death row remain a symbolic sentence without an ending, or will the state eventually choose a different path? Indiana's death row tells a story not of constant executions, but of long pauses, unresolved sentences, and a system caught between law and practice. For more than a decade, the state has kept the death penalty on the books while choosing not to use it. The cells remain occupied. The legal authority remains intact. But the final act has not occurred. This reality affects everyone involved. Victims' families wait without resolution. Inmates live under sentences that never reach an end. Courts and lawmakers operate within a framework that no longer functions as it once did. Indiana's experience reflects a broader shift across the United States. It shows how capital punishment can evolve from an active sentence into a prolonged condition, one defined more by waiting than by finality. Whether the state will resume executions, formally end the practice, or continue in suspension remains unknown. What is clear is that the death penalty, as it exists today in Indiana, no longer delivers certainty. Instead, it leaves behind questions about justice, purpose, and the long-term impact of punishment without resolution. If you found this documentary informative, consider liking the video, subscribing for more factual crime and justice documentaries, and sharing your thoughts respectfully in the comments.